Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. Small Claims Court was a special part of the New York City Civil Court, obviously for small claims, and it had a special schedule. It would run from Monday through Thursday night from 6 p.m. until midnight, theoretically, and you would get it. A judge would be assigned in rotation, and it would come up every 5 or 6 weeks in your rotation. You would have to do a week in Small Claims Court. And you didn't mind it because there was on Thursday, a judge would do a double shift. You'd work in the daytime in Small Claims Court. There's a day session that would specialize in senior citizens to make it convenient for them to come to court and safe. And then you would do the night session. And that meant you got Friday off, and you would have a long weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, which was an appetizing thing. It was nice to break the monotony. Small Claims Court would start out in the evening in a big auditorium where they'd call calendars, and there would be big crowds. There would be literally hundreds of people there. Now, what people didn't know, when the clerk would call out the name of the case, it'd say Smith v. Jones, Harold Smith versus Marvin Jones, and they would answer. And if they said here and ready, they would be assigned to a referee. There would be lawyers who would work as volunteer referees to adjudicate the small claims cases. They had the authority to do it. They had the full authority to do it, and they would be binding decisions. They were volunteers. A lot of the lawyers did it because it was a good credential for them on their resume to say that they had been referees, and a lot of them were aspiring judges maybe, and wanted to get some experience and show that they could actually do a good job. Well, the only way you could get a judge, there was only one judge who was assigned for these hundreds of cases, and the only way you could get a judge, but nobody told him, but was to say, ready court. And then you would get the judge. And the problem with that is there was only so many that a particular judge could handle, just a few every night. And people who wanted ready court would probably more than likely be adjourned. And some small claims cases that wanted to see a judge were adjourned probably even for a year, 2 or 3 months at a time or 6 months at a time for a year. The place was staffed by basically one judge with his principal law clerk, one court clerk. Usually the chief clerk of small claims court is a senior person because it was a nice assignment. One court officer for the judge, and 3 others for security in the big rooms, and then going from room to room with the referees. And then, of course, there were court interpreters as were needed. And Queens being a polyglot community, you always needed all kinds of different interpreters: Russian interpreters, Spanish interpreters, Creole interpreters, French interpreters, you name it, we had it. And they would work depending on the cases and the need. Myself, I had a good reputation among the court officers and clerks. My law clerk, my principal law clerk, was in both cases. I was there for 4 years. 3 years, I had a young lady who's now a judge, Maureen McHugh, and she was phenomenal. And she and I would conference cases together or separately. And between the two of us, I would knock out 1 to 3 trials in the course of 3 hours from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and also handle and dispose of 10 or 12 motions. And I would do all of this with Maureen's help. She would do conferences and do motions as well. All of this we do before 9 o'clock, which made us preferred assignments according to the court officers and clerks, because they'd be done, instead of being done at 12, they'd be done by 9 p.m. And they loved that. So they would rearrange their schedules, and they would ask me. I would walk down the hall and say, Judge, when are you going to be in small claims? And Maureen, when are you going to be in small claims? Or Claudia, who was my fourth-year court attorney, when are you going to be in small terms? And they would maneuver their schedules and volunteer for small claims when we were there, because we were quick and prompt. And we had fun. We had lots of fun. And small claims, this is Judge Judy on steroids. This is the real thing. And it's really, really a wide open, Wild West kind of a courtroom. The litigants came in all sizes, shapes, colors, religions, ethnicities, you name it. There was a full range, and including there were some who were habitual litigants, people who kept coming to court. There were some who were psychotic, and this was a place for them to act out and get attention and get people to listen to them. And then there were, of course, the vast majority of them were genuinely aggrieved, and they had a particular dispute that they had to settle, and or thought they had a dispute, and all of this made up the mix. One thing that most of them had in common: nobody brought proof. If you got proof in small claims court, it was a surprise. And people, when you'd ask them, well, they would say something and say, "Well, where's the proof?" "Oh, judge, I have it. Where's the evidence? I have it. I left it home." I said, "Well, that's good. Are you decorating your kitchen? Is it hanging on the wall or something like that? Because you didn't bring it to court. And where do you think you were going to need?" "Oh, I forgot. I was nervous," and they would make up all kinds of stories. But very few people had proof. But you never held that against anybody, because nobody would get their matters adjudicated, and the calendars would just build up. So you played fast and loose with the law and the legal requirements, because on a practical basis, the vast numbers dictated, your actions and how you had to do anything. So the cases, as I said, would involve sad cases, wild cases, phony cases, real cases, just like the people that were bringing them. Now, a couple of the habitual guys were noteworthy. One of them was a Russian immigrant who used to bring his father for evidence. This guy had a racket. He would list himself with a certain company as off limits for phone calls. Certain companies, you could do that. Big companies, if you didn't want a phone call, you could say, "Don't call me." And when they called him, he would then sue them. And invariably, they would send a lawyer and give him $250 as a nuisance case, just not to pay the lawyer for a whole night or a whole trial. And this guy made a living from these things. And it got a little bit annoying after a while. So after the third or fourth time that this guy pulled in, he had no proof or anything like that. He told me, "Oh, they called me," and I said, "Well, where's the phone record?" "Oh, they called me. I'm telling you, my father's here. My father can tell you." I said, "Does your father speak English?" "No." I said, "Well, how does he know what they say?" "Oh, he heard it. He understands English, but this guy had every answer for every question." And I said, "All right, that's enough. Case dismissed." But I said, "You sound like a motorboat, my friend. What's going on?" He said, "You can't dismiss my case." I says, "I did dismiss your case. You come here all the time. You don't have proof. This is a racket that you're running. It's a scam." He said, "You can't do this." I said, "I just did it, and I did you a big favor." "You did me a favor? How did you do me a favor?" I said, "Because you now have a one-page appeal record, and it's very cheap. For about 50 cents is all you're going to have to pay for this record. You buy a page of the transcript of the record, and you can go and appeal, okay? Out." And he went, and he didn't like it. Then another guy would come all the time. He was in the business with service restaurant kitchens. He would fireproof systems for restaurants. And he was there all the time. He had a regular thing going. I don't know. He would promise people to do work and didn't do it or didn't complete the job and then sue them. And he was abusing the system. And this guy, I didn't know it, but I got a poison pen letter that said I should be burned in the ovens in Auschwitz, and I should be dismembered, drawn and quartered, hung, burned at the stake. He wrote a real nasty letter, and I gave it to security. And the chief clerk, a guy named Joe Trainer, who was a dear friend of mine, is a swell guy. Joe cross-referenced it. He said there was another case like that. Another judge got pretty much similar letters. The Nazis were right. You killed judges and blah, blah, blah. He said, so we cross-referenced it and found out the other judge looked at his calendar on the night he got his letter and looked at mine and the night I got my letter. And then we had a common litigant, and we found out who it was. And states and the court security people at this guy's door knocked on the door and said, "That's it. The jig is up. No more. Stop the nonsense." And he was the guy. And it was very clever in how they did it. Then we have crazy cases. There were two neighbors from Astoria, older men, and one of them was very angry with the other one. He was a right winger from Argentina. The other guy was a left wing guy, and he was gay, and he was from Chile. And they would call each other fascist or communist. And the guy who was the fascist kept trying to spite the communist, the gay communist, by putting glue in his door locks. And he kept doing this, and it would come back from time to time, the same guys with the same dispute. Once we had a young lady show up. We call it the Polish flower case. This kid was about 23 years old. She was absolutely gorgeous. She could be in the movies. And she had a coffee shop, and she was suing a contractor, also a Polish guy. And He was supposed to have done some work. He was her landlord, and he was supposed to have done some improvements in return for her signing the lease. He promised her to do some work in the place, and he didn't do it. The chief clerk, a guy named Billy, had been there for 25 years. When he saw this young lady, he comes to the bench and he said, "Judge, take a look at this girl. Give her anything she wants. I'll serve the papers." He said, "I'll go anywhere, sir. Just, you can't refuse." I said, "Billy, I have to call the case like it is, you know." He said, "Please give her anything she wants. Look at her; she's gorgeous," and she was, by the way. But we did it, and we ended up settling the case. And the landlord wasn't a bad guy; it was a misunderstanding, and we got him to promise, and he made good on it. And then we had a case, and I'll call this guy Leslie Good. Leslie Good was not his real name, but I want to keep away from that to protect the guilty here. He was a convicted rapist, and he was an habitual litigant in small claims court because he was psychotic, and he was a bully. He tried to bully women all the time, and he would get up and claim he was a member of the CIA, the Secret Service, the FBI, whatever was handy, astronaut, whatever it was. And he was a violent guy. In fact, whenever he came to court, they would send up two of the biggest bruiser court officers they could find to be in the courtroom. I told him I didn't need the help. Don't worry about it. I'll handle him. I had him a couple of times, and in the final analysis, he came up to probably the third time. And I said, "You know what, Mr. Good? It was a total nonsense case. He lived with his mother, this guy. He was a real piece of work and a complete liar." I said, "You know what? I'll tell you what you're going to do. Your case is dismissed. Take your act to Brooklyn because we've seen it here and you're boring me now, okay? You're boring everybody here. We know what you're going to do. Every time you come up here with this nonsense, you're boring everybody. Get out and stay out. And don't let the door hit you where the dog should have bit you." And the court officers hustled him right out the door. He didn't like it, but he never showed up again. And hopefully he took his act to Brooklyn where it might have been a little fresher. Then we had a case, and my court officer was a very attractive, big boned gal, an African American woman named Vicky. And she was a sweetheart. She was great sense of humor. She was a great mom. She was a single mom. She had two teenage kids that were absolutely gorgeous. She took them around traveling. She was just a first rate person. And Vicky one time said, "You know, Judge, do you know my nickname?" I said, "No, what's your nickname, Vicky?" She said, "They call me Big Sexy." I said, "Really? You too, Vicky?" I get that all the time. And we both cracked up laughing. You know, I'm like 5'7" on my best day. And Vicky, a case comes in, and I said, "What kind of case is this?" She says, "Oh, Judge, this is a He Don't Love Me Anymore case." I said, "What?" "Yeah, He Don't Love Me Anymore. You'll see." I asked, is a young lady is a plaintiff, and she's suing a young man. It turns out they were sweethearts. She gave him money to get a black limousine so that he could be in his own private limousine business and be a private chauffeur. And this had gone on for about a year or two. And when they broke up, she then sued him and said it was a loan. He got up and said, "No, it was a gift. She gave me this 2 years ago, and it's a gift." And Vicky looked at me and she said, "See, he don't love me anymore." She says, "We get these cases all the time where they give gifts or the couple breaks up and then they say it's a debt and you have to sort it out." Well, another case I had involved two Chinese beauties, one middle-aged woman. Both of them had the same last name, Wang. Mrs. Wang and Miss Wang. Mrs. Wang was 55 years old and as handsome and as pretty and as youthful a 55-year-old as you'd ever want to see. And she was dressed in the most expensive, simple, but starkly beautiful clothing. Young Miss Wang, who she's suing, was a movie star. She was as good looking as Mrs. Wang, only she was 26, not 55. And this gal could stop traffic. That's how pretty she was. And also, she was dressed in very, very expensive and understated clothing. And I'm saying, what's going on here? So I said, who's the plaintiff? Which Wong is the plaintiff? And Mrs. Wong said, "It's me, Judge." I said, "Okay, ma'am, tell me what's going on here." She said, "Okay." I said, "Then make it to the point." She said, "Okay, my husband and I are in the export-import business. We bring in specialties from China, special ginger, lychee nuts, all sorts of spices and candies and confection and everything else." I said, "Okay, that sounds good. What's going on? Well, our business grew, and my husband said we need more help. So we have to hire her. And she points to the defendant, the young Miss Wong. And I said, so? She said, well, she worked for 2 years and she doesn't work hard. She doesn't even work. And my husband says, oh, she needs a car for her work. So we bought a car. I said, really? Yes. I said, so what does that got to do with anything? Well, the car crashed and it's her fault. I said, wait a minute. Do you have an accident report? She says, yes. She handed me the New York State MV 104, an accident report. And I said, well, wait a minute. It says here, driver such and such Wong. Who's that? She says, that's my husband. It says, owner such and such Wong. Who's that? That's me. The car is in my name. I said, well, what did Miss Wong have to do with the car that was driven by your husband and owned by you? She said, this is a company car that we bought, and she tells him where to go. He drives her here, and she made him drive her on this day, and they had an accident. I said, wait a minute. She has nothing to do with this. By the way, did you have insurance on this car? Yes. Did you collect insurance? The car was damaged? Yes. I says, and now you want to sue her? She didn't drive. She doesn't own the car. And you had somebody else who crashed with your husband driving the car. Yes. I said, no, 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 no. She said, wait. She said, and I believe, I think she have sex tapes, videos with my husband in the tape with her. And I said, excuse me, Mrs. Wong, but I'm not interested in the sex tapes. You don't have, she have the sex tapes. I said, I'm really not interested. And right away, one of the clerks and Bernadette, the court officer, a veteran court officer who's a total sweetheart, Judge, what do you mean you're not interested? That's evidence. We have to look at the evidence. I said, no, we don't. I said, no, come on, Judge, don't pass up. It's evidence. You may find out something. I said, listen, she doesn't have any tapes, and it has nothing to do with this case. I said, okay, Mrs. Wong, I said, I understand how you feel and why you feel the way you feel, but you're in the wrong court. If you go across the street to Supreme Court and you sue your husband for divorce, you'll be in the right court if you want to do that, okay? So I have to, with all due respect, I have to dismiss the case. Ladies, go home. Good night. Thank you. And that was the end of that case. I then had a case with my court attorney, Maureen, had conference and she said, Judge, this is a problem. I'm going to send this guy and the other guy to you. I can't solve this one. I think they're going to have to see the robe. You know, they'll have to deal with the judge here, and you have to lay down the law. I said, okay. They came, and I said, who's the plaintiff? And this old gentleman, he was a septuagenarian, an older man, and he had no teeth, no upper teeth. And I said, yes. He said, his name was Mr. Goldstein. I said, Mr. Goldstein, what's the problem here? He said, well, Judge, I went to the dentist and I paid him and he's supposed to do this work. And look at it. I have no teeth. This is 2-3 months have gone by already and I'm waiting for the teeth and nothing happened. So I looked at the other guy who was well-dressed guy, and the old guy was kind of shabby with no teeth. And I said, are you the dentist? He said, no, I'm the dentist's lawyer, Judge. I said, well, what's the problem here? He said, I don't think it's a problem. I think if you give us a short adjournment, this is Monday night. If you let us come back, you're going to be here all week. I said, I'll be here till Thursday. If you let us come back till Thursday night, I think I can get this thing straightened out with my client. I said, well, your client was obviously picked by this gentleman because he has a good reputation and he's a dentist. He has a practice. I'm sure he doesn't need a court case or he doesn't need a litigation to sully his reputation or his practice. He said, no. This is a total misunderstanding. We will straighten this out. And if you give us a short adjournment till Thursday night, we'll come back and it'll be straightened out. So sure enough, Thursday night comes. I adjourned it and they came back and they said, we're ready to settle, Judge. I said, very good. We sorted it out. The dentist is continued the treatment and is going to wrap up in another week or so. And Mr. Goldstein said, I said, are you satisfied? Yes. No, Judge, that's it. He says, we've got it worked out. He said, now, I said, okay, the case is over. The case is settled. We're going to dismiss the case by stipulation, settled by stipulation. Yeah. He said, is the case over now? Mr. Goldstein said. I said, yes, it is. He said, okay, can I talk to you? Can I say something? I said, well, if you have to. Then he's just right in front of the bench. I said, what is it? He said, Judge, you know me? I said, no, I don't. He said, you know who I am? I said, I'm sorry, I don't recognize you. He says, I'm Al Goldstein, the publisher of Screw Magazine. I said, really? Yeah. And Screw Magazine was famous in the 70s and 80s. It was a semi-pornographic or pornographic newsletter magazine that went around, and it had a lot of customers and a lot of notoriety because it was such a wacky proposition. And he said, I just want to tell you, I've been here now twice, and I have never seen anybody run a courtroom as well as you run a courtroom. He said, you just do it with quiet grace, and you treat everybody so well and everything else. It's the best courtroom I've ever been in. And you know, as publisher of Screw Magazine, I have been in 100 cases in 100 different courtrooms all my life. That's all I was. I was in and out of courtrooms, people suing me left and right, and this is the best one I've ever been in. Well, that was a nice compliment. And my supervisor had dropped by, and I said, why don't you tell her? Judge Bernice Siegel, who's a dear gal, a good friend. I said, tell Judge Siegel, yeah, this is the best judge, and his law clerk is terrific, and she's beautiful. Is she married? I said, yes, she's married. Well, if her husband needs any tips, tell him to call me, and I'll help him out. I said, all right, thank you, Mr. Goldstein. You can leave now. Thanks a lot. Okay. And he went out. Well, that's a little sampling of what goes on in small claims court, where very little testifying goes on, but a lot of test-lying goes on. And you want the truth? It reminds me of Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise in the movie A Few Good Men. Everybody wants the truth, but very, very few people can handle it. And in small claims court, the fact of the matter is you need a search party to find the truth. Good luck and happy hunting. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law. Lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.